Okay, so let's say we're looking at carbohydrates now. Well, let's look at someone eating a long strand of starch in the form of a hamburger. Well, a hamburger is going to have lots of protein, but the bun is going to have a lot of carbohydrate. So when you eat the carbohydrate, which is in the form of starch, which is just a carbohydrate, gets into the gastrointestinal system. The gastrointestinal tract is going to break it down into small um, uh, uh, sugar molecules, different types. So a disaccharide is just two sugar molecules attached. A monosaccharide is a single sugar molecule. And glucose is an example of a monosaccharide. So in your gastrointestinal tract, the starch will be broken down into smaller and smaller components, such as disaccharides and monosaccharides, that will get absorbed and then can be stored as glycogen in the liver or in the muscle cells if it's not required for energy immediately. Okay, so here's just some examples of simple sugars or simple carbohydrates, meaning they're very short in length. There's usually just one or two sugar molecules attached, and complex carbohydrates, which we would use, for example, starch as an example. And a lot of foods that we eat are complex carbohydrates. A simple carbohydrate that we would uh, ingest would be, say, a sugar drink, such as Coca-Cola, right? That'll just have simple carbohydrates in them. So the body will take the Coke with the sugar in it. It'll easily break it down um, in maybe one enzyme process. If it's just straight fructose or glucose, it doesn't even have to do that. It just absorbs the fructose and glucose, and the body decides, I have way too much fructose and glucose. I'm going to store the glucose as glycogen. Or if I have too much glycogen, I'm just going to take the glucose and convert it to fat and store it in my fat cells. Okay? So, so simple sugars are typically just one or two sugar molecules. Um, and if it's two sugar molecules, they're attached with a bond, right? So sucrose, lactose, maltose, those are all just simple sugars you can eat. Complex carbohydrates are longer strands of simple sugars. So starches, um, pasta as an example, right? They're just longer strands. Now there's some carbohydrates that we can't break down because we don't have the enzymes to break them down. So, for example, um, animals such as cows or horses can derive um, sugar from eating grass. We don't have the enzymes to break down grass. So we don't have the enzymes to break down certain fibers, so we can't use them as energy. But there's many enzymes where we do have that can break down complex carbohydrates. And a perfect example of that is wheat, bread, uh, pastas. We can break them down to simple carbohydrates and use them as energy or store them as glycogen. Okay, so let's look at some carbohydrate details. So carbohydrates are typically spoken about in the setting of ingestion, so for energy. And let's just talk about how they're digested a bit, right? So so when we eat carbohydrates, whether it's in the form of complex carbohydrates, or simple sugars, which really don't need a lot of breaking down, except in the small intestine into even smaller molecules such as monosaccharides. But let's just say we have some starch or carbohydrate like bread or pasta. The digestive process starts in the mouth, right? Because saliva has amylase, which is an enzyme that breaks down carbohydrates. At least it starts to break down carbohydrates. So that by the time the carbohydrates arrive in the stomach, they're already partially digested into polysaccharides, which are still chains of sugars, but not as large, and then much smaller carbohydrates and sugars such as sucrose, lactose, and maltose. And those are just sugars with two sugars attached, right? So sucrose, lactose, and maltose can easily be broken down in the small intestine. So anyways, once they arrive into the stomach, there's very little digestion that occurs in the stomach for carbohydrates. It's a very acidic environment. The stomach has multiple layers of muscle that can churn the food and also move it forward into the small intestine, where there's pancreatic amylases. So the pancreas can secrete digestive enzymes to break down carbohydrates, to break down fats, which would be called lipases, and to break down proteins, which will be called proteases. So pancreatic amylase will continue the breakdown process until you essentially have monosaccharides, just single sugars, such as galactose, fructose, and glucose. And they easily will get absorbed into the bloodstream and travel to the liver, right? So most blood from the intestines, whether it's the stomach, the small intestine, or the large intestine, travels back to the liver through what's called the portal system or the portal vein. So all of these areas, the blood supply, go back to the liver for processing. The liver doesn't want to let in anything that hasn't been processed a bit. It wants to check out all the molecules that are in the digestive system. Okay, so the portal vein delivers, whether it's carbohydrates, proteins, fats, medications, almost anything will go to the liver first for processing. Okay, now the sugars that arrive into the bloodstream or into the liver can then be stored in glycogen, whether it's in muscle cells or in the liver. And then when needed, the glycogen can be broken down and used to produce or turned into glucose first and used to produce the energy currency of the body called adenosine triphosphate, which is ATP. So glucose goes through a breakdown process. The first part of the breakdown process is called glycolysis. There'll be much more detail on that in coming modules. And then it goes through a cycle in the mitochondria called the Krebs cycle, where a lot of ATP, a lot of energy can be obtained by the breakdown of glucose. Okay, so let's talk about lipids a bit. So lipids or fats can be eaten and digested for storage or for energy use. But lipids also have multiple roles in the body as well, right? So the body will make lipids to perform certain roles that we'll discuss in the following slide. So when we see the term lipid, we usually think of, oh, okay, so lipids are often in the cell membrane. Yeah, phospholipids make up our cell membrane. When we're describing a lipid, it just depends on how many fatty acid chains they have that are hanging off the glycerol. So monoglyceride, diglyceride, or triglyceride lipids, just dependent on the fatty acid chains. Okay, we'll go to the next slide and we'll look at some uses of lipids in the body. Okay, so what does the body use lipids for? So first of all, so fats or lipids are a source of energy that are stored in adipose cells as triglycerides, so 3 fatty acid chains. Often when you eat fats, fat-soluble vitamins come with the fat. Which are the fat-soluble vitamins? A, D, E, and K. Okay? And you'll learn much more about the vitamins as modules go on. But those are the fat-soluble vitamins. So you can imagine, for example, if you weren't able to absorb fat for some disease in the gastrointestinal tract. Well, not only are you going to not be able to absorb fat, which is energy, and likely you'll lose weight, and the fat will go into the stool. And fat tends to be oily, greasy, and it's lighter than water, so it'll float on water. So if you're not absorbing fat, you'll have greasy stools. Okay, but at the same time, you're not going to be absorbing your fat-soluble vitamins, such as vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin E, and vitamin K. And each one of those have different roles in the body. Okay? Insulation. So fat deposits under our skin as adipose tissue provide insulation to us to regulate temperature. Okay, so that's an important role for fat. Protection. A lot of the cushioning of our body or even around organs are performed by fats. Okay, it's definitely the major component of cell membranes, which are phospholipids, right? So the phosphate head with the lipid chains going inwards. Fats provide a lot of covering and insulation for nerves, which is called the myelin sheath, right? Which allows for faster conduction of action potentials down nerves. Fats are heavily involved also in production of hormones, steroid hormones in particular, because steroid hormones are based on cholesterol. So cholesterol is the main base for which certain hormones called steroid hormones are produced. And that would include estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. So you're going to hear about protein-based hormones, and you're going to hear about steroid-based hormones in the body and the functions that they perform. Okay, so let's look at one of the main reasons for lipids, and that is to have a cell membrane on every cell in your body, right? To separate it from the extracellular space or fluid and have an intracellular space and fluid, which is called the cytoplasm. So it's called a phospholipid because you have your lipid, which is your glycerol and fatty acids, that's attached to a phosphate molecule. The phosphate and the glycerol are hydrophilic, so they face towards the extracellular or the intracellular fluid in a biphospholipid layer, and then you have your hydrophobic tails going inwards, away from any water molecules. Okay, and if you can imagine hundreds of thousands of these going in a circular fashion around a cell, you have your cell membrane. And within the cell membrane will be all kinds of proteins that are lodged in, channels, you'll have receptors. It really is an amazing system, even just one cell of the body, to have this cell membrane that then has all kinds of molecules floating around within it to maintain communication within the cell, and also to be able to communicate through hormones with attaching to receptors with other parts of the body. So pretty amazing. Okay, and when we're talking about fatty acids that we're eating, say, or that are in the body, but let's just say that we're eating them. So fatty acids and lipids. A saturated fatty acid has no double bonds. It's fully saturated. Okay, and what's it saturated with? Hydrogen ions, or hydrogen elements of hydrogen, right? So you can see in the top there, that is a fully saturated fatty acid. Okay, unsaturated means that there's double bonds, so there's some hydrogens missing. Because as long as you have 4 bonds around a carbon molecule, it's complete in terms of its electrons. So you can either have 4 hydrogen atoms around a carbon molecule, or you can see at the end of the fatty acid there's 3 hydrogen molecules and then 1 attached to another carbon. It doesn't matter. It wants 4 bonds attached to it. In the unsaturated, it's getting its 4 bonds by a double bond below, with another carbon. So if you see the red area of the unsaturated fatty acid, you can see that there's a double bond there, and it's completing the fact that those carbons still have 4 bonds. And when a fatty acid is unsaturated, it bends it. Okay, so it's not as linear as a saturated fatty acid. It tends to kink it a bit and change its direction. Okay, so those long fatty acids and a glycerol group that attach make glycerides, right? And we saw in the image above monoglycerides, diglycerides, and triglycerides. And in the body, triglycerides are the most common, right? It's a form of energy storage in fat cells. Now, other parts of the body take advantage of glycerides. So there's all kinds of chemicals that are used in the body that you'll hear about that are made of glycerides. Prostaglandins. Well, prostaglandins are heavily involved in the inflammation system of the body. Leukotrienes, another group that are part of the inflammatory system of the body that you'll hear about. Okay, so in fact, prostaglandins are responsible for generating fevers. They're responsible for activating different parts of the immune system. And you'll see that certain drugs that you'll learn in pharmacology inhibit prostaglandins, such as aspirin is one of them. And there's some drugs that inhibit leukotrienes to try and reduce inflammation. Okay, so now if we look at saturated fats versus unsaturated fats, typically saturated fats are animal fats, and they're usually not as healthy for you. Okay, compared to unsaturated fats that are typically plant-based fats, nuts, seeds, and they're often a much healthier form of fat to ingest. Okay, so when we look at glycerides, there's a glycerol group, a fatty acid group, and then you could make a monoglyceride, a diglyceride, or in this example, a triglyceride. Okay.